whether China will break the mold or not, I mean, that's going to be the big question for the 2020s and 2030s. And a lot of, I mean, it may seem a little bit parochial to talk about big investment decisions, but a lot of companies and investors, you know, will make it or fail, but by taking the bet on that. I mean, my own view about that is that I think the headwinds that are building up in China are not exactly insuperable, but I think they are very, very difficult for the current political regime to overcome.
Hi, George. Thanks so much for being with us.
Good to see you, Maggie.
So it's such an important time to have this conversation. And I know you've been a China watcher for a very long time. You've written books about it. You've been sort of, really tracking what's happening there. How would you describe China right now? Is it operating from a position of strength or weakness?
Well, I think it's operating from a position of, well, certainly relative weakness. I mean, I don't think it'd be right to say that China is, is a weak state. President Xi Jinping, although we call him president, but actually in China, his status actually derives really not from his being president, but from his being general secretary of the Communist Party and head of the military commission. And everything we know about the party, the army, security services, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it certainly seems that the People's Republic is in a kind of pretty robust position and feeling very feisty about itself and its role in the world. But the economy is at a tipping point. I don't think there's much question about that. And if you just stop to think that China's projection of power and its eruption on the global scene in the last 20 or 30 years has been intimately tied to its economic heft, then I think there is a case to answer as to whether, China's relative position, certainly to what it was and what we fear and think it might be, is something that we need to look at very closely. Because if its economy is at a tipping point, as I said, and maybe it's only going to grow at 2 or 3% for the next 20 years. Maybe it's going to go through a period where it might not grow at all. If these things come to pass, then of course it's a very different China from the one that we've become used to,
and one that would have major implications for everyone, for the rest of the global economy. Certainly implications for Xi, too. So he's looking, President Xi, General Secretary Xi, looking for a third term, an unprecedented third term. How firm is his grip on power?
I'd like to say a lot of people use the word unprecedented, so I don't blame you for using it. It's not unprecedented, strictly speaking, because there were no term limits on Mao Zedong's tenure in office. So I prefer to use the word groundbreaking, because when Deng Xiaoping changed the way in which leadership succession was going to take place, I mean, this has been the norm really since the 1980s. So it's not unprecedented, but it is definitely groundbreaking, and it's different from what, again, we've become used to. But I would say that despite the fact that there's been a lot of speculation about whether he's in a particularly strong position or whether there are opponents, there were even rumors not all that long ago in the month that we're just finishing in September about a possible coup, and he was under house arrest. I mean, all of this proved to be, I think, rather fanciful. I mean, he is in a pretty strong position as things stand, and he will, as far as anybody can tell, be crowned for this groundbreaking third term, which effectively means that he could be head of state in China for life if his health allows and his enemies allow. But that last statement actually is a good segue, because there is no question that there is opposition, right, in the Communist Party to many of the things that are happening in China. People don't like what's happening in the property market, for example. They don't like some of the agglomeration of power around a single individual, which he has garnered around himself. Some people are very worried about losing important external relationships, including, by the way, with the United States. So not everything that Xi Jinping stands for is universally approved within the party, and there certainly are um, groups or factions or individuals who certainly have their heads below the parapet now because it's just too dangerous to stand up and cry, opposition. But if the tensions grow in China, in the economy, and in the political system, as I suspect they might, then yeah, we don't really know how secure his position is, or indeed whether there might be rivals with, kind of anchors, shall we say, in the PLA and in the security services who might one day think that it is time to move against him. But a lot will depend really on what happens to the economy and what happens to China's behavior and performance in key kind of global theatres like Taiwan, for example.
Hi, I'm Raoul Pal, the CEO and co-founder of Real Vision. The financial world is a complicated world right now. It's a really complicated macro picture, and there's a lot of risks. Real Vision and our YouTube channel help you navigate those risks. So subscribe now to the channel and never miss an update. There is simply too much going on. So subscribe now. Thank you.
There's that saying from the U.S. political campaign some years ago that everyone hates, but it always rings true, and that is, it's the economy, stupid, right? It always come back to that, no matter what you're talking about. It seems one of the issues and problems has been COVID, the COVID zero policy, which has really hurt economic growth. Do you think that he'll change his tune on that once he secures another term? What do you see happening with that?
Well, a lot of people have wondered whether they were just keeping this going until the 20th Party Congress was over and then they might relax it. It's possible that we may see, we won't know this when the Congress is taking place on the 16th of October and just after, but gradually things will leak out or be made public. And it's possible that decisions will be made to try to kind of relax maybe the implementation of zero COVID policies. But I think I'd be surprised, to be honest, if zero COVID policies were not around in some shape or form for quite some time yet, maybe certainly into the spring or summer of 2023. The reason for that, I think, is twofold. The first is there are, of course, very good public health reasons why the Chinese government feels it is and should be committed to zero COVID. Not enough older people have been vaccinated. mRNA vaccines are not ubiquitous yet, although they are trying to develop their own. The hospital capacity of the Chinese health system is not great. So if China were to experience the same kind of case rate and then fatality rates that Hong Kong had at the peak of its own COVID outbreak, then China's health system would be pretty seriously challenged. And that would be politically bad, obviously, for Xi Jinping. So I think there are public health reasons why they may want to keep this going a bit longer. There's also, I think, surveillance and security reasons why they kind of like what surveillance and zero COVID policies do in terms of social control. So it kind of suits China in a way. There's a nationalist streak in China. There's a very kind of bunker mentality, references to hostile foreign forces, whoever they are, obviously, in Hong Kong, in Xinjiang, with regards to Taiwan and so on. So this is, it kind of suits in a way to have high degree of social control. And so even when zero COVID kind of eventually does go, which I assume it will, elements of social control that we see as part of that, I think, will be maintained. So bottom line is, I don't think there's an early exit coming for zero COVID, but it may kind of drift away rather than be abandoned or just changed.
The political leadership likes it. What about the population?
Well, it's quite interesting because in this year, and particularly this summer and autumn, fall, we've seen quite a lot of social protest, actually. Some of it was very obvious, particularly when the Shanghai lockdown was on. But there have been and are regular appearances on social media, Chinese social media, which make their way onto Western media as well, of street protests, of people chanting from apartment blocks, and not just about zero COVID, but also people are very, very concerned about what's going on in real estate and to their mortgages and so on. So I'm not really expecting a kind of sort of an outbursting of public protest, which the internal police have to kind of suppress. Although those kinds of things do happen quite regularly. If there's going to be a threat to Xi Jinping, I suspect it comes from much higher up in the echelons of the Communist Party. But these forms of social unrest are not unimportant, and they do influence the government in certain ways. Not always well, but they do influence them.
You said something really important before, and that's that, there's no press release that goes out at the end of the Congress saying, this is what we've decided to do, right? But there is, usually some kind of intelligence or some roadmap that does come out, whether it's leaked or whether it's, from people sort of parsing the tea leaves. What are you expecting? Because it is kind of seen as the roadmap for 5 years, the next 5 years, because this meeting only happens every 5 years. What do you expect the priorities to be? How is Xi going to sort of shore up the economy, especially if he's not going to throw open the doors and drop the COVID policy, and he's got these protests brewing, which, although early, may be watched by his opponents who are kind of lying in wait. What do you think the priorities will be for the economy?
I kind of thought that we might touch on this, and in my mind, I'd sort of prepared an answer, which was, people think about the 20th Party Congress as though this was this is the end of, one 5-year term of office, is the beginning of the next 5-year term of office. What changes are going to happen? I don't see this really as a pivot point at all. I think I think there's a continuity which we should be aware of. So what you see and have been seeing in China for the last 2, 3, 4 years, that's what China is about for the next 5 years or 10 years. So I don't see that really changing. I think there will be some things that are going to be worth watching, right? So lots of people will be changing positions or coming into new positions of authority, some on the Politburo, some on the Politburo Standing Committee, and many, many more across the broad structure of the hierarchy of the Communist Party. And there's been a lot of speculation as to who will stand down because of age, who won't be reappointed, which people will become more prominent, who will, for example, take the position of premier when it's expected that Li Keqiang will step down as premier. He might get another kind of position in the government, but he has, he's not really had a particularly prominent role to play by the standards of previous premiers in China, because Xi Jinping has kind of almost taken that kind of function away from him or from his position. But it'll be interesting to know who the premier will be. It'll also be interesting if Liu He, who is the sort of Xi Jinping's, one of his main economic advisors, again, not always with the influence that he might have had, say, 8 years ago in different positions, but who he's widely known and trusted in the West or in the democratic world, shall we say. But it'll be interesting to know who will take his position if he steps down, because he's of a certain age where he would not normally be reappointed. So whether the new blood that we see is going to be Xi Jinping loyalist blood or whether it'll be technocratic blood, I think will make a big difference to the way that we think about what might happen in China. In a way, I'm not really even then expecting great kind of tremors, because even if technocrats are appointed to key positions, Xi Jinping is still the boss, and nobody is really going to go against him or speak out against what he likes or wants or has articulated. So there are limits to what even technocrats might be able to do. But that will be one interesting thing to watch. What will also be interesting is perhaps some of the more sort of internally important, internally to the Communist Party, important changes or procedures, whether, Xi Jinping thought is kind of blessed really in the same way by the party as Mao Zedong thought was in its day or subsequently. And lots of things to do with the status of the leader and how he is perceived and what that involves really in terms of the authority of him, or his authority, and also, of course, of where the party wants to go in terms of extending its own kind of reach. But bit by bit, we might hear in due course the possibility of kind of proposals that are out there for property tax, for example, which was something that was aired a couple of years ago very loudly and then dropped again. This is also, particularly in the context of the property market, something which people are looking at quite closely. But there are lots of things to do with reform. I mean, everybody thinks, or most people think, that reform as we knew it has pretty much withered on the vine. That's not to say that reform has died. I mean, there is reform going on, but it's reform to make the state and the party and state enterprises even more strong and dominant. So how that all happens and what kind of initiatives are taken, and indeed whether, because of the problems which the Chinese economy is facing, whether the old kind of pragmatism that we associated with China in decades gone by, whether any of that still, has a breath. So what they do about real estate, for example, and about consumption. I mean, these kinds of things, people wait with bated breath for changes in. I'm not wildly optimistic we will see a lot of change, but certainly for a few weeks and months, they'll be worth watching.
Yeah, I think, and it's a fantastic point, because I do think we tend to think of our, Western sort of elections as a marked change, because you're usually voted in because, or elected, or however the system works, elevated to power because people want to see change. So we tend to think of these things, these political moments, as ushering in change. It's very interesting that maybe a continuation is what we see. But they're going to have to do something, right? I mean, what is their plan to grow the economy?
I mean, we will hear, I imagine, more about a campaign or a slogan which Xi Jinping launched less than 2 years ago called Common Prosperity. Now, Common Prosperity, the kind of knee-jerk reaction to that was, they want to basically do something about income inequality. So they want to kind of reorient the economy so that people are better off and can aspire to higher living standards and so on. But it hasn't turned out, at least yet, to be anything close to that. In fact, all we've had in terms of the hard policies of common prosperity are really a kind of a coercive way in which the party has made private firms make donations towards party causes and goals as a way of keeping the regulators off their back. So, so having the corporate sector basically cough up more money for important social objectives, maybe, you can pigeonhole that as perhaps one way of basically redistribution or redistributing income. But actually, there's really been nothing in the way of, proposals on the tax system, nothing in the way of social security reform, nothing in the way of changes to the so-called hukou registration system, under which, sort of 70% of rural migrants who work in cities don't have access to public goods and services like health, welfare, social security, and so on. So many of the things that I think people expected might be shoo-ins for addressing obvious signs of income inequality, social immobility, very low levels of educational attainment for working age people still. We've not really heard and seen anything of that. And yet the campaign still does speak to issues of material prosperity, spiritual prosperity, follow Xi Jinping thought, and we will grow up to become very prosperous, dominant nation, and so on and so forth. But what sort of changes? I mean, again, I'm not really that optimistic that we are going to see the kind of changes that in kind of liberal leaning democracies we think are compatible with reducing income and wealth disparities. I think China is very much a sort of corporatist supply side. And I don't mean supply side in the way that we think about supply side, but they do a lot of things that make life easier for companies and give them tax breaks and deregulate and so on. But actually, China's need is not really to serve the needs of capital. There's a lot of capital in China, but there's not enough consumption, and they don't really do enough to make and shift resources to the consumer, to the service-producing industries. It's still very mercantilist, very industrial, very corporatist in its overall attitude.
Which I guess makes sense when you're state-run and you've got this increased state control and monitoring of the populace. Can a more consumption-driven economy exist within a firm, authoritarian, state-controlled government? Are those two things at odds?
Well, in theory, yes. I mean, it would require a lot of change in the way in which the Chinese government thought about managing the economy and about changing the distribution of resources. So what I've been describing is kind of a system in which there is very, very kind of high concentration of policy attention around companies and around firms and around industrial policy, particularly with state enterprises in the vanguard, really, and not enough that's allocated towards the well-being of citizens. And I mean, the idea is that citizens will benefit as firms become richer, wealthier, more expansive, more global, and so on. But that kind of, if you want to call that a trickle-down effect, I mean, that hasn't really been very much in appearance. And in fact, the share of consumption in China's economy is probably still not that much higher than it was, 10 or 12 years ago, despite all the talk about rebalancing. There's very, very rebalancing has actually happened. It will, but I think it'll happen not so much because the Chinese develop a kind of a penchant for helping the consumer and redistributing wealth and income from the state sector to the private sector, but simply because a lot of state-oriented activity in infrastructure and real estate and heavy industry, I think is basically going to stagnate or decline, which means de facto that you'll see a mathematical increase in the share of consumption in GDP, but that's because GDP is going to grow very slowly. Ideally, what you'd like to see is the economy growing at maybe 4 or 5% and consumption accounting, persistently for 80 or 90% of that growth. That would really get it up to levels which were more consistent with, say, emerging market peers like, Mexico or Turkey, let alone OECD type of economies. But I don't really see that happening. I don't think that's the mindset of the Chinese government.
Yeah, we saw, so much of that powerful growth that we saw and the innovation came from that kind of quasi-liberalization, being able to live with a little bit of capitalism under that state-run umbrella. Have they completely moved away from that? Because we saw what happened with Jack Ma and, some of the very senior officials who built these world-class companies, Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent, Huawei. Many of them have stepped aside, have dropped out of, the public eye, if not left the country. Is that era over? Can they innovate and get that growth under the leadership and the structure that Xi's put into place right now?
I think there are a couple of things here. I mean, you use the term innovation, which is correct. And in fact, a lot of what we see in, for example, the 14th five-year plan, which runs out until 2025, and in other policy documents, I mean, the Chinese talk, as we all do, incessantly about innovation and new technology and so on. Innovation, though, is you have to be careful how we use the word. Innovation isn't just about doing clever stuff and having good kit. I mean, the Soviet Union had a lot of good kit. And even Russia today has, kit. Actually, finding out in the military sphere that actually the kit ain't that good. But actually, you can have a lot of good kit without having a particularly innovative economy. Innovation, I think, is primarily about businesses and about business processes and about branding and commercializing and taking initiatives to broaden out the use of new and more sophisticated technologies away from the sources of those technologies, so the Alibabas and the Googles and so on, but actually into the boring bits of the economy, like wholesaling and distribution and retailing, transportation, and so on and so forth. So they're the kind of companies that basically you'll only ever read about, if ever, if people still, buy their newspapers or read their newspapers in hard copy. They're usually on about page 20 of the Wall Street Journal rather than at the front page. So this is what I think kind of innovation is really about. And that's about a business culture and about a private enterprise culture that we think works, basically. Now, in China, what's happened really is with Alibaba and Tencent and Didi and lots of other firms, it's not that the government has basically decided that private enterprise is a bad idea and they want to nationalize everything. That would be far too crass. And actually, I don't think they really believe that either. But I think what they do think is that the private sector needs to serve the goals of the Communist Party. And to do that, I think they certainly brought down Jack Ma, who obviously became far too big of a celebrity in his own right. And have introduced, I mean, they have kind of stopped doing this in intensity now, but for 12 to 18 months, there was a kind of a full-on blitz of regulation designed to crimp data platforms, technology platforms, finance platforms, private tutoring platforms, anything that basically involved the collection, use, manipulation of data. I mean, these companies have had a pretty rough time, actually, and this was accompanied by a lot of other things, which was a little bit less, well, not quite as obvious on the radar screen. One was actually the progression of a policy that had been in place already, which is that for every company that has more than 3 party employees, there has to be a party committee close to or in operational management, where the responsibilities of the individuals is to basically foster the interests of the party when it comes to recruitment, training, management, compliance, all of the things that we think about as kind of day-to-day corporate governance. The other thing is that there was a kind of a statement or a document issued by one of the kind of main propaganda departments in China, which was kind of an advisory document, really, about how and in what ways private entrepreneurs and firms should think much more like they don't only have business and commercial priorities, but they also have social and moral goals, which the party defines and which they're expected to pursue. So across a wide range of kind of activity, really, not just in terms of regulation. I mean, private firms are being, in a sense, told to self-censor and to make sure that whatever they do is consistent with and compatible with whatever the party's narrative happens to be on whatever it is. So it's a more subtle form of control than nationalizing companies. It doesn't mean they don't believe in private enterprise, but they do believe in controlled private enterprise as part of this recalibration of industrial policy.
Can that work? Are there examples where that has been successful?
Well, I guess if you spoke to a sort of random group of Chinese economists or China or certainly party economists, they'd probably tell you, yes, I don't know which examples they would choose, to be honest. I mean, it's something which is quite alien to us. We think that
Yeah.
we think this kind of system would stifle initiative, would stifle risk taking. It would prevent failure, which we think is a learning process. This is just the way that we think. But I don't think we should be under any illusion that that in China, they wish they could only have such a system. Actually, maybe some people do. And in fact, there are intellectuals and academics that actually do think that entrepreneurship and innovation by private firms is really how China did erupt in the first place. And they've lost that under current government leadership. But actually, in the party, I mean, there are plenty of people who will tell you, I'm sure, that in China, we would do things differently. Now, there's no empirical evidence to suggest that a state-run system that operates in this way can achieve or has achieved high-income status. We'll see. China may be the first, or it'll just follow a long line of other countries that failed.
It's a massive experiment on a massive scale that has massive implications for the global economy.
It does, and it's quite unlike any other country in that regard. So Russia, I'm sort of old enough to remember in the Cold War, they used to call the Soviet Union Upper Volta with nuclear weapons. But actually nowadays, Upper Volta is now Burkina Faso, and I don't want to kind of say anything insulting about that country, but Russia today is proving that it's a big resource and minerals bully with nuclear weapons, but its economy it doesn't even figure really in terms of the league table of leading economies. And there really aren't any other places that are big enough or sophisticated enough with this kind of state and autocratic type of system, which I think can claim that kind of leadership. China potentially is the exception because it's already a $17 trillion economy. And it does do clever stuff. There's no question about it. And it has very, very smart people. So whether China will break the mold or not, I mean, that's going to be the big question for the 2020s and 2030s. And it may seem a little bit parochial to talk about big investment decisions, but a lot of companies and investors, will make it or fail, but by taking the bet on that. My own view about that is that I think the headwinds that are building up in China are not exactly insuperable, but I think they are very, very difficult for the current political regime to overcome.
There is, I'm so glad you laid it out that way, because I think there's a tendency for us, for those in the West, to just believe at the outset of the conversation that it's impossible to do that, right? It's impossible to kind of have a sort of, nationalistic private sector, I guess is how you're describing it, where it serves the Communist Party, like that sort of marriage. But there are an awful lot of people who will point out that capitalism is not having its best day right now, and the income inequality and this sort of free-for-all with money as the driver, as opposed to a political agenda, hasn't really panned out. And there are a lot of people who are disenfranchised and upset about that. So I suppose you could sort of make that argument that, well, the other alternative hasn't worked either, so why not try something else? Presumably, that's what they're saying in China.
Well, that's an interesting and a worthy kind of debating point, but it's a really, really big pool to get into, right? Because
right.
we've had, the financial crisis of 2008, and then, a productivity crisis because we haven't really had much, and then COVID, now, energy crisis, cost of living crisis, inflation is back. There's no question, as you point out quite rightly, we are going through our own kind of soul searching, really, saying, well, what is the right model? If reliance on, total deregulation and small state and market forces, if that's not the answer, what is? Now, it doesn't follow that what the answer is what exists on the other extreme, which is a state-run capitalist system. I mean, it's capitalist in some respects, right? So prices do exist in China for outputs of goods and services, but the freedom to set and change prices for inputs, so land, labor, and capital, is not the same as it is in a normally functioning capitalist system. So it's a blended capitalist system with state, a dominant state. So that's not, I don't think, what we are. Anybody in, well, there might be some people, obviously, in.
If you're on Twitter, there's always someone.
Yeah, there's always somebody who thinks that. So there are people that think that that's the model that we ought to embrace. Most people think, it's not that far to the left. It's maybe further to the left than we have been, but we're still kind of thrashing around trying to find what the right mix is and the right balance.
Right.
But that's one thing. I don't think, though, that that's really the same as trying to emulate the Chinese model. In fact, I think there's quite an interesting struggle that's really started now. So, we can assume really that none of the richest countries of the world are going to align with China on very much, except areas where there are maybe things of common interest, like, global policing and climate change and that kind of thing, health, public health, etc. But obviously the pitch that China is making to the so-called global south, and which belatedly, but nonetheless, it's happening now, I think, but the pitch which obviously the United States and Europe and Japan and other liberal-leaning democracies are making to emerging countries and developing countries. I mean, there's a real struggle going on here, which is, we want you to align with us. They may not be so amenable to aligning either, with one or the other. They may be, as somebody said, that a lot of countries nowadays are promiscuous. They may want to go with this power for these reasons and this power with, for different reasons on something else. But the idea that China represents an economic model that other people want to copy, I don't think that really gains a lot of traction, in my view, or in my perception. They may like to align with China for lots and lots of different reasons, not least of which is it's not America, it's not Europe, it's not anything, it doesn't have a colonial past in the way that we do. There are reasons that, people may align with China because China, lends money without asking questions about human rights, etc. So there are lots of reasons why that may be the case: Chinese infrastructure, Chinese goods and services, Huawei, etc., etc. But it's not, as far as I can tell, because they think the Chinese model is exemplary. And that's really quite important, I think.
It is. And when we were talking about that choice, of course, it was only in economic terms. There is this whole human rights issue, quality of life issue, freedom issue that was not part of my question to you, which I think weighs into this debate massively, especially in the information age we're living in and how much you can really control that. What we hear a lot of people talk about the shadow banking system in China. You've been looking at the informal economy. How do these things, what do we need to understand about those aspects of the Chinese economy? Because we know we can't rely on the official data. What's going on the ground there?
I mean, China produces copious amounts of data, to be fair, and not all of the data series are as poor as GDP. GDP is probably the worst. And as the sort of long-time China commentator, observer, and professor Mike Pettis has pointed out tirelessly, the way in which GDP is used, or kind of its role in the Chinese economy, is quite different from everywhere else. For us, GDP, or for most countries, GDP is the outcome of all the kind of spending and investment decisions that people make over a given period, whether it's a quarter or a year or whatever. In China, you start off with a GDP target and you try to hit it. And local governments are the agencies that basically are in the situ to do that. And the problem is that to try to hit that target, you often end up sanctioning or approving or spending money on unviable or uncommercial projects, which basically embed bad GDP that has to be written off at a loss and with a cost to the economy sometime down the road. Anyway, so that's a different kind of topic. But there is a lot of data that is quite useful and gives us quite a handy idea about what may be going on in the economy regardless. Now, some of this data I think is quite interesting, and a lot of it has been unearthed, really, or exposed, I would say, by Stanford professor Scott Rozelle and co-author Natalie Hell, who wrote a book in 2021 called Invisible China. And it's really an expose about some of the things that we never really associate with China, like, for example, that educational attainment of the workforce is actually very low. Only about 30% of people of working age have secondary school, high school qualifications or higher, and only about 15% have university degrees or equivalent. Actually, these data were taken from a 2015 survey. More recent data suggests these numbers are a little bit higher, but even so, it gives the lie, really, to the idea that, China is swarming with, highly educated Shanghai school students, and everybody is like that. And the truth is, it's not. Along with this kind of reflection about just how advanced or well educated the workforce is, there have also been a lot of interesting kind of studies that they and others have kind of pointed to that show that many of the high productivity jobs in manufacturing and construction have actually been disappearing for the last 7 to 10 years. And actually, most of the jobs in China now are low pay, low skill, gig economy type of jobs, which obviously pay much lower wages than higher productivity manufacturing and construction jobs. Obviously, with property in a funk, there isn't going to be a lot of construction going on, or certainly not nearly as much as there used to be. So there is there's a sort of a level of detail of economic thinking and analysis which exists in many, many places below the levels that we traditionally look at. Because we look at, aggregates, we look at officially sourced data published by, perfectly respectable agencies like National Bureau of Statistics or other kind of Chinese think tanks. But obviously, everything is political. So every data series, most data series have a political story to tell. And you won't really see a lot of data and kind of analysis unless you have people on the ground that are doing the research about the underground economy, the gig economy. I mean, to us, it's ubiquitous, and people, journalists are looking at these kinds of things all the time. It's not as easy to do in China. So I'd say maybe this wasn't important 10 years ago. It's very important, I think, in the 2020s.
So interesting. What does the role of demographics play?
Well, I think it's really important, but I don't think it's nearly as deterministic as sometimes kind of made out. So China is it's not the oldest country on the planet, but it's certainly the fastest aging, right? So if you look at the old age dependency ratio, which is the proportion of, people aged 60 and above, because the retirement age in China is 60 for men, it's 55 or 60 for women, depending on the kind of work they were doing. So if you look at the proportion of the population over 55 or 60 as a proportion of younger or working age people, that dependency ratio is rising faster in China than anywhere else in the world. And by 2040, 2045, on most demographic metrics, China will be a significantly older country than the United States. So that's quite important. And actually, along with that, we now know from census data in China that actually not only that the working age population, age 15 to 60, started to roll over and dip in about 2012 and will do for the foreseeable future, but actually the total population size, about 1.41 billion people, probably either is in the process of peaking or will do in the next 2 or 3 years. So that in 10 years' time, India will be the biggest and most populous country in the world. So these population pressures are certainly not compatible in a way with some of the things that China might aspire to, particularly because under the surface there, you not only got declining working age and total population, but a lot of that population is going to be male. In other words, there's gender imbalance in China, which is not unique to that country. I mean, it exists in some Indian states as well as in some other countries. But where you have big population, 30% of males will never expect to get married because there aren't enough women. A lot of this is about the legacy of family policies that were introduced in the 1970s. More that than the one-child policy, by the way. But also lots of families that are so-called beanpole families, where you have lots of generations of families, sort of, grandfathers, great-grandfathers and mothers, and all the way down to children, but children who have no siblings, no cousins, no kind of network in their family. I mean, these are also kind of social issues in a society where networks and family networks actually count for a lot. So these are not insuperable problems economically, because we kind of know how to solve these problems. I mean, you can do it via immigration, you can have it by raising the retirement age or social security eligibility age. You can do it by having incentives for better childcare, so more women can go to work and have kids. And, if you could switch on a magic productivity switch, then, that would solve the problem too. So there are ways in which you can overcome these problems, but you have to have a strategy. First of all, you have to recognize you've got a problem. Then you have to have a strategy for dealing with it. And again, I would say that China is not necessarily unique in this regard, but it doesn't really have an aging strategy.
Can China grow their economy without foreign investment?
I think it can, up to a point it can, okay, because foreign investment is, if you look at the kind of hundreds of billions of dollars of capital that have been invested in China by foreign companies over the last, 20 or 30 years, it's still dwarfed by, the amount of investment that takes place inside China by Chinese enterprises. But where I think the value of foreign investment really lies is in know-how and in technology. And there are lots of things that foreign companies have, I would say, not overlooked in the sense that they weren't aware of it, but they weren't prepared to make a big issue of some of the awkward idiosyncrasies of doing business in China from a regulatory and legal point of view, as long as they felt in the past that the business environment was good, the markets were growing rapidly, and that they would be viewed as, friendly collaborators, and so on and so forth. The trouble, I think, that's happened in the last few years is particularly with deterioration in kind of Sino-US relations and, Sino-Western relations, really, is that the business environment is no longer regarded as benign as it used to be. Not only is business tough, but the regulatory environment is tougher. The political environment is more problematic. The European Chamber of Commerce in Beijing, which along with the American Chamber of Commerce, they both represent thousands of companies. They both produce regular reports and survey their members about what their members think about the outlook for China and doing business in China and future investment. The EU Chamber of Commerce recently published a report in which the executive summary was that politics trump the economy. I mean, that's a pretty bold statement by a representative of foreign companies to say in China. But it actually speaks, to use a kind of a Communist Party phrase, it actually speaks truth to power. It's actually saying to the government of China that, politics seem to have taken over from this relatively more benign view towards foreign businesses that used to be the case in the past. Hasn't been helped by zero COVID, of course, because you can't get farms and their families or personnel in and out of China. They have to go through complicated quarantine, etc., etc. This hopefully will not be an enduring problem, but even without zero COVID, there are big headwinds, I would say, for foreign companies who might still see, good growth in terms of market size if they're selling luxury goods or machinery and equipment. Certainly for technology and financial services, China still has a voracious appetite, semiconductors. But a lot of companies are now kind of beginning to sense that much of what they do, not all, but much of what they do, crosses into this very sensitive area now known as national security. May be forbidden by export controls or by sanctions or by regulatory agencies at home, not to do things, not to sell things, not to produce things, which previously they did. So I think this whole environment for business is going to become more complicated. I think expectations that future investment in China will be lower than it otherwise might have been, I think will be validated. And I think the Chinese are committing self-harm, really. China erupted by embracing engagement with the rest of the world and outside ideas. And if it kind of shuts itself off or does its own version of decoupling by trying to keep out foreign firms or by emphasizing self-reliance, which it does, then I think it's doing itself a disservice. Yeah.
The report they issued, Politics Trumps Business, could also be the impression we're left with coming out of this party Congress as Xi consolidates political power, but there are not a lot of answers on how they plan to grow the economy. Is China investable now? Not from a company point of view, but for investors who might be looking at that economy, or is it, given all the headwinds, just does not look attractive?
Yeah, this is a question which has been sort of going around in financial markets, I think, for part of this year, to be sure. If by investable, if you mean, are the markets liquid enough and, are there enough participants to be able to make prices and trade in and out? The answer, of course, is yes. I think what people mean when they say China is China investable is should I put my money there? I think that if you know what you're doing, if you're an experienced asset manager, or you have your savings with experienced asset managers that do know China and they know the politics and they know the regulatory environment well, then I don't see any reason why. The world is actually not a particularly safe place at the moment anyway. So I don't see why China is necessarily a more unsafe place than UK gilts, for that matter, at the moment, to take one example. But yeah, I think it presupposes,
which is an extraordinary statement in and of itself.
It is. I hope I wouldn't have to say that actually in more than a month's time. I hope this will blow over, but we'll see. But if the question is, can you trust what the government is saying? Can you trust what Chinese companies say? It's tough, right? It's hard because so much politics are involved. People have to stick to official narratives. You don't really get the full story, even if people don't deceive. You don't really get the full story from analysts in China because they don't really want to put a foot wrong and they don't want to say the wrong thing. So it's very hard, I think, investing in China, unless you know people, who really do know the country well.
Do you expect China to make a move on Taiwan? The international community seems, really fixed on this idea. Do you see that as a real possibility?
If everything has a probability, then yes, there is, of course, a probability that it may use military or blockade or cyber means to try to incapacitate and take control of Taiwan. Do I think it's very likely in the foreseeable future? The answer is no. I think the answer is no, not because necessarily that the Chinese don't have the military capacity, although I'm not a military expert, but military people do say that it may not, it's more complicated. The logistics of landing in Taiwan are quite difficult. Suppressing, a country of, much larger than Hong Kong, there's no comparison, et cetera, et cetera. I don't really have a judgment about that other than to kind of hear what they say. Ultimately, the decision is political. right? Is whether to kind of move against Taiwan or not. And I think the Chinese still have a huge amount to lose by engaging in, I mean, much greater offensive action with regard to Taiwan. I mean, it's still the case that something like, China imports 80% of its semiconductors from the rest of the world, and almost all of its more advanced semiconductors, which it gets from the TSMC foundry and capacity in Taiwan. So one can only imagine that if China did actually make seriously aggressive moves towards Taiwan, that the United States and other countries wouldn't sit there with their arms folded and just say, fine. I mean, so there would be sanctions. The Chinese reaction to the sanctions against Russia was one of horror. I mean, they didn't think that it would happen. They certainly don't want to, and they've been quite assiduous in taking action to avoid becoming the victims of secondary sanctions by breaking the sanctions against Russia. So I think these things do worry them, and they should, actually. But who knows? The political calculus can change for all sorts of reasons in the future. So we obviously can't be complacent about it either.
Last question. What does the international community risk getting wrong about China? Where's our blind spot?
Let me put it this way. There used to be a time when a lot of people were enthralled to, the inevitability of China's economic rise and its dominance in the global economy. I actually think that consensus has changed, as I think it was bound to and deserves to. So one thing that we might get wrong is that the new consensus, is wrong, that actually China will change politically and pull kind of the finger out of the dike, so to speak, and sanction a number of kind of groundbreaking reforms to free up or to revitalize reform and opening up, which is the campaign slogan on which China thrived for so long. The chances of that happening, I think, are pretty slim, right? So I don't think we're going to get that wrong for the most part. Where we might be wrong is in our political calculus about China. And that could swing both ways. It could be that we are over-interpreting how strong Xi Jinping is and how vigorous his hold on power is, and that actually there are forces kind of gathering against him at some point in the next decade. But it could go the other way too, in which he is so powerful and so fearful, powerful and fearful at the same time of things going wrong at home, that the nationalism in China reaches levels which become very difficult to control. So I just think the status quo politically in China is it's comfortable in the sense only that we think it's not verging to extremes of instability, but that instability may emerge much more as an issue in years to come. I mean, not least because of things going on at home, which we haven't really kind of spoken about at least. But one of those things is, I think, a kind of a power tussle between central and local governments about who picks up the tab for the bust in property and for the cost of remedial action on income inequality. These are two very, very big issues for political governance in China in the next 5 to 10 years. And it's not clear how these are going to be resolved without anybody getting hurt.
And that's so interesting because we view it so much as a top-down economy. Where would the pushback from local governments, wouldn't it just be immediately cracked down on?
Well, the problem here is, local governments in China, I mean, they do a lot. They are the kind of agents of economic activity, really. And they account for pretty much all of the kind of health, education, welfare, social security, infrastructure spending. They have their own state enterprises. I mean, there's central state enterprises, but there are local government state enterprises too. They compete very vigorously with one another for business. and many of them are bust or have difficulties servicing their debts because they've become so indebted in the last 12 years. So their business model actually doesn't really work anymore. And their debts are the contingent liabilities of Beijing, of the central government. So the central government doesn't really want to compromise its balance sheet because on paper it has debt of 20% of GDP. But if you look at the contingent liabilities of the central government, they're 6 times as big. So it's 120% of GDP, which is even bigger than the United Kingdom. This is kind of a serious political issue. I mean, ultimately, you have to think that the central government will win and will pick up the tab eventually, but there'll be a cost for local governments. I mean, they'll have to, their modus operandi will have to change, and actually, then the credit status of Beijing will deteriorate as a result. And you might find that they haven't got all the monies that they thought they had to spend on some of their pet projects, including, armaments.
Is that the greatest challenge that Xi faces in a third term? That tension around the property bursting and who picks up the tab?
It's a byproduct, a very important byproduct of the property bust. But actually, keeping the biggest challenge, I think, if you had to rank them, certainly is going to be how to ensure that the Chinese economy can grow at all, given that China has to deleverage not just property, but the economy, and also ensure some kind of relatively smooth, it won't be smooth, but relatively painless downsizing of the property sector. It's according to this famous paper that everybody knows now by Rogoff and Yang, broadly defined, real estate accounts for 29% of GDP. Yeah, you can't have 29% of GDP stagnating for a decade or more, and expect everything to be calm and dandy. It's just not going to happen. So it's a big problem for the government to manage a process of adjustment in which property is downsized in the economy and allowing something else to kind of taking place. There isn't actually anything single sector that can take its place. So it's a very, very difficult adaptability issue that the government has to face.
George, this has been an amazing conversation. As I think back on it, I think that the real lesson or learning for me is that the sort of change we may all think is coming, or the sort of next 5-year plan, may look an awful lot like we are looking at now, where you're seeing political power consolidate, a continuation, a great new experiment maybe launching to see if it can be this sort of new form of state-run, corporation-led private sector, something that looks different than what they've done before, that doesn't really have a precedent anywhere else in the world. So that's a political experiment, but it's going to be really challenging given the underlying economic issues they face around that delevering that you just talked about. Is that a fair recap?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in a nutshell, it's a huge governance challenge, right? I mean, we have very, very different ideas about what constitutes good governance. We being the liberal-leaning democracies versus China, and we think ours works best, and Beijing thinks that its version is going to work best, and we think it'll fail, or certainly be found wanting. We'll see.
George, thank you so much. The answer to that question is going to have huge implications for all of us.
Indeed. Thanks very much.
There was so much good stuff in there. My takeaway from the conversation with George is that while investors may be hoping for a pivot and reboot of the Chinese economy following the Party Congress, continuity is the more likely outcome. Politics trumps all things business is the headline for the foreseeable future. So what does that mean? George doesn't see a quick rollback of COVID policies. He thinks Chinese leadership quite like having the surveillance state in place. Common prosperity will continue to be the economic narrative, although that doesn't mean a redistribution of wealth in the way that many had hoped for. Instead, George thinks China is embarking on a new experiment where the private sector will be allowed to exist, but with the purpose of serving the needs of the Communist Party. This was a really interesting part of the discussion for me. Unlike state-run capitalism, where communism and capitalism coexisted, this new system allows the private sector to continue to operate, but subject to the Communist Party. So much so that George says new rules mean that companies above a certain size have party officials embedded in the offices to make sure that's happening. That has big implications for investors. Will it work to boost economic growth? George doesn't think so, given the headwinds. He makes the case that China's society is not as educated as many were led to believe. It's aging rapidly. It's not as innovative and faces massive deleveraging because of the property sector that will put local governments at odds with the central government. And those are just the economic problems. Bottom line, President Xi may secure the job for life, but his ability to keep opponents at bay will depend on resolving these really tough economic challenges. Otherwise, something will break.
We hope you enjoyed the video. At Real Vision, we help you understand the complex world of finance, business, and the global economy with in-depth analysis from real experts. Join the revolution at realvision.com.